Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? It's good to see you. Hi, Gita. I see Gita just showed up. We've all been talking about coffee. I am sporting the Bojangles coffee today. Their line was not too long, so that's what we've got out here. Their line was not too long, so that's what we've got. Whoa, didn't have my telephone volume cut off, so we're getting an echo. Aloha to you as well, Ash. Yeah, right. As well as some pretty decent biscuits. Although I'll be honest, I try to avoid those because those are not good for the gut. And I'm always working on that. Hold on. Let me get all formal here. I decided to do another collared shirt today because the response I got last class. So I may even start breaking out collared shirts for you folks. Hi, Maya. Good to see you. Right. Got a pretty good crowd. Ha! Yeah, right. You better say that, Ash. Okay, so let's see, I didn't have time today. I usually don't have it in the morning. Fancy. Right, Sarah? Tara? You like it, huh? Oh, by the way, this week's Neuromatrix is going to be about the classic behaviorists, Pavlov and B.F. Skinner that we're going to be talking about today. So we talked a little bit about Pavlov, and I reserve the right to ask you questions about the UCR, UCS, CR, and CS, all the parts of a classical conditioned experiment. There may be a question about higher order conditioning, and maybe even I might even want you to know whether or not might want you to know that Pavlov was a physiologist. Who knows? So I have 5 questions on Pavlov and 5 questions on Skinner. How about that? Oh, goodness me, I forgot. It is Zest. I forgot how to say good morning. It's good to see you, though. Chest. Is that better? Dzień dobry. And so, Maya, you said good morning, didn't you? See, I know a little Polish already. How about that? Only one lesson. Okay, let's see. It's 11:01. We've probably got everybody we're going to have today. Small crowd, but let's go ahead and get started. Maybe I can give you some secrets today that will give you an advantage over your classmates. All right? Turning into a Polish man, absolutely. International man of mystery, at home in any of 35 countries. Because I have friends there now. Okay, so today we're going to review the behaviorist principles. We talked about them on Tuesday. I talked about them in every Wednesday, every optional webinar we had, and I'm going to hammer on them for a couple more minutes today. Then we're going to talk about the other form of associative learning that behaviorists were interested in, which is operant conditioning. And then we're going to talk specifically about how we can think about these consequences in terms of applied behavioral analysis and behavioral modification programs. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about shaping, and then we're going to revisit the limitations of behaviorism. We already talked about that a bit as well in webinars when I was talking about the demonstration of insight as being problematic to tough behaviors perspective. Absolutely, Austin Powers. Okay, so remember, let's go back to these fundamental behavioral principles that I told you about, right? So you see here a couple of quotes from John B. Watson that he gave at his behavioral address when he was nominated as the president of the American Psychological Association. So he was top dog when he said this. And basically in the top quote, he says, "Give me any kind of infant and I will turn them into any kind of person that I want." So he was arguing that environment was king. Remember, he was a staunch nurturist as opposed to a naturist. All right. And then in the quote below, he says the behaviorist cannot find consciousness in the test tube of his science. What he means there is that you cannot measure this thing called consciousness or mental constructs. So I would say that their second basic principles in the behaviorist tradition would be that it is anti-mentalistic. You can't see the mind, and even if you could, it probably doesn't matter anyway. So these are two fundamental hardcore behaviorist beliefs that existed in the early 20th century. Remember, these have both demonstrated to be false in smaller or larger degrees, and so there is no such thing as a behavioral professional degree now. But these beliefs are a little bit outdated, but this represents the behaviorist tradition. And they focused on two models of learning. We talked about classical conditioning on Tuesday, and I talked to you about learning by association. You're a passive learner who just learns to associate environmental cues with reflex responses, such that that reflex response now occurs in response to the environmental cue. Remember, the dog salivated when the meat powder was put on its tongue. They rang the bell or did the metronome before placing the meat powder on the dog's tongue, and after a while the dog would begin to salivate to the metronome or the sound of a bell or the sound of a buzzer. So everybody gets that, right? That's the classical conditioning, learning by association, where the learner doesn't have to do a stinking thing. Now today we're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is learning by consequence. And in this form of behavioral learning, you have an active learner who is searching around, engaging in random behaviors, and those behaviors are shaped towards those behaviors that cause positive consequences and away from behaviors that lead to negative consequences. So we're going to talk about operant conditioning as learning by consequence. All right, so you see you have a picture here of B.F. Skinner, and I've sort of reiterated on paper what I just said, that we have an active learner that engages in random behavior that incrementally becomes non-random based on the consequences of that behavior. I think in webinar I mentioned, at least in 2 of the 3 webinars, I mentioned Edward Thorndike and his cat puzzle boxes. So he would put cats in these puzzle boxes where they had to step on a lever to open the door and get out of the cage that they were in. He would then put tasty food outside the cage, and he measured how long it took the cats to step on the lever and open the door. And what he found was that these cats wandered around pretty randomly at first, and they would accidentally step on the platform, and it would open the door and it would let them out so they could get the food. And he found that if he put them back in these boxes after a while, they didn't step on those pedals randomly. Their behavior changed and became quite intentional, and they would quickly step on those levers and get out of the puzzle box to get the food. And so this represents sort of the beginning of the behaviorist tradition. Of the operant conditioning. Now, this form of learning would be followed up, would be sort of hashed out by the fellow that is right below me. His name is B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner, he's actually from Pennsylvania in the United States, Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. But he's the guy that sort of went through and researched all the different ways in which these consequences affect our behavior. And he's very famous for creating this picture that you see, these two things that you see over here, an operant conditioning chamber and a cumulative recorder. Absolutely, they've mentioned B.F. Skinner. He's a hardcore scientist, and his research was heartless, so I could see where it would really appeal to Sheldon, being a heartless kind of person, right? But we have a Skinner box, or an operant conditioning chamber, and a cumulative recorder. And so, if you would, I'm going to try something, and I hope this works. Okay, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my camera, and I'm going to show you a Skinner box that I actually found while I was a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill. I have to admit, this is the first and only time I ever went dumpster diving. They threw a bunch of these Skinner boxes in the big dumpster out behind the building, and I crawled in one because I just had to have my own Skinner box. And I promise, a lot of you may have taken a psychology class, but none of you have ever had a teacher that owns a real Skinner box, I'll bet. So let's go to the webcam. All right. So you should see the whiteboard right now. I'm going to unhook my camera here. I'm going to try to unhook my camera here. There we go. And this is a Skinner box right here. All right. You notice it's got a little plexiglass container, and you put the animal right here. And you'll notice there are 2 levers, so you can reinforce the animal from pressing one lever or the other lever. You notice that we have lights, red lights and white lights, and you can teach the animal to press the lever only when a light is on or when 2 lights are on. And then up here we even have a speaker where you can play sounds to this rat. I didn't have a rat, so I have a bobblehead doll, a Jarrett Cole bobblehead doll. Okay? And then, because you're keeping an animal in there that poops, right? You've got a little tray. So you'll notice that you can take this tray out and clean out the poop. And when I took my learning class at UNC Chapel Hill, one of the activities that you had to do in order to get credit in the class was you had to spend at least 1 weekend helping clean out the poop trays for the animals. All right, we have the food bowl right here, and there used to be a little pipe where you could pipe food right into a little hole right here. I don't know if you can see that, a little hole that feeds the animal. Okay, and then this electrical wire right here would connect to this thing called a cumulative recorder. Okay. All right, did you folks see that? Were you able to see that? I've never tried that before. Okay, yeah, you did get to see it. And so down here in this side, you see a cumulative recorder. It scrolls kind of like the old paper EKG machine, and there's a stylus. And every time the rat hits the bar, that stimulus bounces up a little bit. And so if the rat starts hitting the bar a lot, that stimulus will start, that little scribbler stylus will start moving up and up. And so do you see how on this cumulative recorder we can tell when the animal starts pressing the bar? Does that make sense? Okay, and so what you can do is you can study how a behavior is acquired, because as the animal starts pressing that bar, you can tell that that behavior has become intentional and has been acquired. And then what happens is if the animal quits pressing the bar over time, the stylus will begin to fall, and you can see the behavior disappear. You can see the behavior become extinguished. So what you would do on this cumulative recorder is you could tell when a behavior was acquired and when a behavior became extinguished. Does that make sense? Now, what he studied, now there are 2 types of consequences. We're going to talk about reinforcers now. You notice I have the red star right beside the reinforcers, and that's because B.F. Skinner spent most of his time studying the nature of reinforcers, and those are consequences that cause an animal to acquire a behavior, for the behavior to become more likely in the future. And punishers are consequences that make a behavior less likely in the future. But let's talk about reinforcers for just a second. Hello, it looks like we have a guest in the classroom today. Hello, whoever you are. I don't understand what language you're typing in, but thank you for coming to class today. I hope you're having a good day, and we're always interested in having visitors in the classroom. Okay, now, what B.F. Skinner studied were these things called schedules of reinforcements. This is the pattern in which the animal is rewarded for the behavior. So if any of you have ever taught your dog to do a trick, to shake hands, to roll over, to go out, use the bathroom outside instead of inside, You've used reinforcers like dog treats. The question is, how often do you have to give the animal these dog treats in order for behavior acquisition to occur? And the first insight that B.F. Skinner discovered was that you do not have to reinforce every behavior in order for learning or behavior acquisition to occur. All right? Now, he demonstrated that we have two types of reinforcement. One type of reinforcement we'll call continuous reinforcement. So you can give the dog a biscuit every time they do the desired behavior, and they will eventually acquire the behavior. And he called that continuous reinforcement. But he found just as effective was the fact that you could just reinforce a subset of the desired behaviors, or you could just reinforce the behavior occasionally at specific intervals of time. And so what he found was that partial reinforcement was just as effective as continuous reinforcement. Sometimes you reward the behavior, but sometimes you don't reward the behavior, and the behavior will still be acquired. All right. Now, sometimes he would, if you saw the little Skinner box I showed you, sometimes he would make the animal press the bar 5 times before he would give him a pellet. And that's called ratio reinforcement. And he could set the ratio to 2 bar presses, to 5 bar presses, to 10 bar presses, to 15 bar presses, and still find that the animal over time would acquire the behavior. Right? This is what we would call ratio reinforcement. And if you look at the chart down here below, diagonally to me, the first chart that's on the left side, that's in the middle of your screen, you'll notice that even though the animal was getting partial conditioning, you'll notice the conditioning, the behavior was still acquired. So the shapes with the hollow shapes represent continuous shaping, and the triangle and circle that are colored in dark represent partial conditioning. And what you'll see is conditioning occurs in either state. All right? Now, that's ratio. He also found that you could, if you wanted, just reinforce a behavior every set amount of time. So I'm going to reinforce 1 bar press every 10 seconds. Now, if the rat presses the bar once during 10 seconds, I'll reinforce that behavior. If the animal presses the bar 10 times during that 10 seconds, I'm only going to reinforce the first behavior. And so he found that you could also do partial reinforcement by reinforcing the behavior every few seconds or minutes. And he called that interval partial reinforcement. Does that make sense? And both of these types of partial reinforcement led to the acquisition of a behavior. You know what? That's interesting, isn't it? And that's sort of an insight that he developed that maybe you and I would not have thought about. The second thing he found, and this might be even more surprising to you, Chris, and I think this is Figueroa. Right. The more impressive thing he found was what he called the partial reinforcement effect. Now, if you quit reinforcing the bar pressing behavior, the animal will eventually quit pressing the bar. This is called the extinction of a behavior. All right, the behavior is extinguished after a while. So behaviors do not last forever. But what he found was that behaviors that were conditioned with partial conditioning were more resistant to extinction than behaviors that were conditioned with continuous reinforcement. Does that make sense to you? So it actually turns out that not only could you reinforce the behavior with partial reinforcement, but it actually lasted longer. I hope somebody types in the chat bar to let me know you got that. Now that is weird, is it not? Now, here's Also, here's something else that B.F. Skinner found that animal trainers probably knew intuitively even before, and that is now used in Hollywood and circuses and with in animal service dogs to train really complex behaviors into animals. All right, so you can actually train an animal to do a complex behavior using reinforcements. You can do that. And I think in one class I showed you the lady shaping the, I think only in the Tuesday night class did we get to this video. I showed you the video of the lady teaching a dog to flip a light switch with its nose, right? That's a pretty complex and useful behavior that you can teach an animal. What the process that she was using in that video was what's called shaping, which is where you use positive reinforcements, little pieces of food, to condition complex behavior. Now, here's the trick to shaping. We have to understand that there's a small problem in our methodology. There's a small problem in what we're trying to achieve. According to operant conditioning, the animal must engage in the behavior accidentally and then have the behavior reinforced. All right? Now, if you're training a dog to flip on the light switch with its nose, your dog is not randomly going to jump up into a chair close to a light switch, reach up with its nose, and flip that light switch. That doesn't occur randomly. All right? Now, how are we going to condition that behavior if it never occurs randomly? Well, what the lady did in the video and what people do with shaping is you find a behavior that is sort of similar to the one you want, and you reinforce the animal until they do that behavior. Once they've acquired that behavior, you quit reinforcing them until they do a behavior that's a little more similar to the behavior you want. And then you start reinforcing that behavior. And over time, what you do is you get your dog to do one behavior that they will do randomly, and then you move them in increments towards the desired complex behavior. Now, these increments of desired behaviors are called successive approximations. Now, if you watch the video of the lady in the light switch, what she had was a light switch she had a light switch on a piece of plywood, and she held it on the floor for the dog. And the first thing she did was she reinforced the dog when the dog stuck its nose anywhere close to the light switch. And so after a while, the dog realized that all it had to do was touch the light switch plate to get reinforcement. But then the dog accidentally flipped the light switch. And when the dog flipped the light switch, she gave him a bunch of rewards, a bunch of extra rewards, and she stopped rewarding the nose touching behavior. And so then he starts fooling around trying to get the reward again, and he accidentally flips the light switch a second time, and she reinforces that behavior. And pretty quickly he learns that in order to get the reinforcement, he has to flip the light switch. She then takes it off of the ground and turns it a different direction. And he now has to flip the light switch, but in a position similar to how the white light switch is going to be. Instead of being flat on the ground, it's now up, like it's going to be in proper position. Once he learned to do that, she then began moving it up the wall. And each time she's conditioning the dog to do a new behavior that it might do randomly, but she's moving incrementally towards the desired behavior. We can use reinforcement to train children. Yes, you can use reinforcement to train children and humans. Absolutely, it does work. It does work. Move incrementally. So an example that they show in your book is teaching your dog how to surf. The first thing you do is get them on the surfboard. Once they put their feet on the surfboard, you reinforce them and you reinforce them. After a while, you make them stand on the surfboard for 4 or 5 seconds before you reinforce them. Then they learn a sense of balance. Then what you do is you make sure that you teach them to stay on the surfboard while you're moving the surfboard. And if they can do that, you then reinforce them. You then push the surfboard and reinforce them if they can ride on the surfboard without you there. So we sort of move in incremental steps from something the animal can and will do all the way up to behaviors that the complex desired behavior that we want them to. Now, a dog may not randomly get on the surfboard, so what you're going to notice is this person kind of cheats and puts the dog on the surfboard. You know what? That actually works too. If the animal's not going to randomly do it, sometimes you can push them into doing the behavior and then reward it. And so they sort of figure out how to get started. So getting a treat for flipping classical conditioning. That's a good point. They got the treat for flipping the switch. That's operant conditioning. The animal engaged in the behavior, and then they were rewarded for the behavior. If the animal didn't flip the switch, they wouldn't get the reward. So the animal realized that they had to do A before they got B. That's not classical conditioning. It's definitely similar to a step-by-step technique. It can't all happen at once. Absolutely, Riley, especially if we're trying to teach an animal. If you've ever been to the circle and an animal puts on a poodle skirt and a dog walks across the ring in a poodle skirt on two legs, balancing a ball on its nose. A poodle isn't going to do that randomly. You have to build with steps. And then there's this thing called behavior chaining, which is where you teach them two independent semi-complex behaviors, and then you teach them how to put those two behaviors together. That's called behavior chaining, but that's beyond the scope of this class. Okay. It definitely works on humans. Now, one of the things, there was a little classical conditioning, Tara. If you'll notice, she used a clicker. Do you remember the clicker from the video? Every time she would reinforce the dog, she did a click, 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 click. Now, animal trainers that train dolphins and water animals, in order to condition an animal properly with operant conditioning, you need to provide the reinforcer within 1 second of the desired behavior. So you have to reinforce the behavior pretty quickly for the dog or the animal to build the associations. If you've got an animal in the water and you're teaching them to do a flip in the water, it's going to take more than 1 second for them to come over for the reward. And so the animal's not going to be conditioned because they can't make the association between the reward and the specific behavior. So what animal trainers like that have learned to do is they first use classical conditioning so that the animal can learn that a sound represents food. So they'll take those whales, those orca whales, and the first part of the training is classical conditioning. They do the clicker, click, 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 give the animal a fish, and the animal loves it and it tastes good. Click, 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 give the animal a fish, it tastes good. Click, 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 give the animal a fish, it tastes good. After a while, when you go click, 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 the animal will think, ooh, tasty food. Does that make sense? And then what you do is when the animal does the trick you want in the water, you go click, click, click within 1 second, and the animal says, ooh, food, and then it swims over to you and you give it the food. Actually, Riley, Edda asked, is it time consuming? Not really. I think the lady with the dog said she trained the dog to flip on a light switch in less than 45 minutes. Okay? It took 45 minutes to teach a dog how to jump up on a set of steps and on a chair and turn on the lights after hearing the word switch. So she taught a dog to do that after she said switch. It took about 45 minutes. Yes, you have to make sure the animal's a little bit hungry. You have to have something they really like to eat, and you have to understand how operant conditioning and shaping works. Yes, it's super duper quick. You'd be surprised the complex things that you can teach animals. And that is why the behaviorists began to believe that we didn't need a mind. If I can teach an animal to do something super duper complex, maybe people learn complex behaviors the exact same way. Maybe we don't need a mind. All right, now, Edda asked the question, can you do this with humans? Absolutely, you can do this with humans. And in fact, you should do this with humans. Now, I'm not a huge fan of spanking. That's punishment. Turns out punishment's not as effective as reinforcement in creating behavior. Okay, to turn or something. So why does it take longer to teach animals to turn or something? It doesn't, Edda. Yeah, it's exactly. You could watch a couple of YouTube videos, go down to PetSmart and get yourself a clicker. Make sure your animal's hungry, and I guarantee you, in fact, if you want, you can set up a Teams webinar and I'll show you how to do it right there while you're on your computer. Well, you might have a stupid dog too. All possibilities are open. Okay, so one application of behaviorism is behavior modification. And behaviorists talk about reinforcers as well as punishers. So not only can you cause a behavior to occur, behavioral analysis believe you can also extinguish negative behaviors by punishing those behaviors. If any of you have ever been spanked, your parent is trying to extinguish a behavior by providing what we call positive punishment. Positive punishment, you say? What are you talking about, Chris? Well, they're adding something that you don't like. The adding of the belt to your butt is uncomfortable. You don't like that. So that's what we would call a positive punishment. And the goal of a positive punishment is to extinguish a negative behavior. All right? Have any of you ever been put on restriction before? Oh, okay, so we don't have a foreign guest. We just have some of you talking in other scripts. Have any of you ever been put on restriction before, or had your car keys taken away, or had your cell phone taken away? Anybody? Okay. Okay. Yes. So absolutely. All right. Well, that's what we would call a negative punishment. A negative punishment. And that sounds weird too, but what they're attempting to do is to extinguish a behavior by taking away something you like until you until you quit doing the undesired behavior. So if you stayed out past curfew and your parents took your phone away, it's so that you won't stay out past curfew again. If your parents caught you lying and took away your cell phone, they took away your cell phone to stop you from lying to them. Okay? Yes, and sometimes your parents and the police can take away your license in order to stop you from driving inebriated. Now, you didn't do that, Riley. Nope. That's not a negative reinforcer, Michael. That's not a negative reinforcer. That's a negative punisher. A punisher is anything that's designed to decrease the frequency of a behavior. Now, here's the crazy thing. I can use a positive or a negative reinforcer. Remember, a reinforcer is a consequence that's designed to make you want to do a behavior. So, if I give you a piece of candy for asking a question, or if I give you extra credit for coming to class, that is a positive reinforcer. I am adding something you like in order to convince you to do that behavior again. That's a positive reinforcer. Let's compare that with a negative reinforcer. How about every time you come to webinar, I take a 0 off of your grade? Would you come to webinar if I took a 0 off of your grade, assuming you had some zeros? Right? That would still be reinforcing, but am I giving you anything or am I taking something away? So that's what we would call a negative reinforcer. Does anybody know what of course, absolutely. I had a student one time that was embarrassed when I mentioned that you were coming to my webinars for extra credit. He thought I didn't know that. I'm like, dude, that's why I'm giving you the extra credit. It's a positive reinforcer. I'm trying to get you to come to class. Have any of you ever seen a choker collar on a dog or a bit on a horse? You know what I'm talking about, a bit on a horse? Right? If you want a dog to walk this way, what you do is you tighten up the choker collar on their neck, and the dog is uncomfortable. They're in an aversive state. If they walk the direction you want them to come, the pressure is released on the neck. So a choker collar can be thought of as a negative reinforcer, if you will. Of course, right, I would too, because it's a better class seated. All right, so in applied behavior analysis and behavior modification, what we do is we try to create worlds where we reinforce the behaviors that we want and punish the behaviors that we don't want, okay? So I have two sons. Both of them are pretty good in school, but my older son loves school and gets the purpose of it. And my younger son, Zach, Z, doesn't get it. And it's kind of funny that you have a nickname for me, Leanne. All my baseball friends call me C-Rod, and we all call my son Z-Rod. And you know what? Sometimes I feel like I have to motivate Z in order to engage in the appropriate behavior. And so here are some of the ways in which I try to motivate his academic behavior. And what I want to do is, as I tell you these, I want you to tell me which type of outcome consequence is this, okay? So if I give Z $20 every time he makes an A on his report card, what kind of consequence am I giving him? Is it positive or negative, and is it a punisher or a reinforcer? It is a positive reinforcer. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you know what? Z brought home a bad grade one semester. He brought home a D. And I made him paint the garage. He freaking hated it. What kind of consequence was I giving him then? You were a little bit incomplete, Etta. It's positive, but it was a positive reinforcer. If I make him paint the garage so he won't get a D anymore. Exactly. Tara, Michael, you are both right. Leanne, not quite. I was giving him because think about it, it was positive because I was adding something to him, a job, and it was a punisher because the job was supposed to be so obnoxious that he wouldn't want to do it again. Okay, so that would be a positive punisher. Okay, you know what? I like my boys to be in by 10 o'clock on school nights. And on the summer, I make them come in at 11 o'clock because no good happens after 11 o'clock. You know why I know that? Because I was out after 11 o'clock and I know what happens. And so during the summer, I tell Z that if he makes straight A's, I will lift his curfew for the summer and let him come home at 1 o'clock. Okay? What would that be? What type of consequence would lifting his curfew if he agrees to make A's? It is a negative reinforcer. Whoop, whoop, Tara Solomon, right on the money. Fantastic. And then finally, if your dad takes away your car keys because you made a D, that is a what? A negative. Nope, not a, nope. Nope, you're all around it. It is a negative punisher. I'm taking away something he likes so that he won't engage in a behavior I don't like. He makes a D. I don't want him to make a D. So I take something away he likes so he won't do that again. Does that make sense? It's a negative punishment, a negative punishment. The negative punishment is always the tricky one. Hint, hint, wink, wink, neuromatrix, wink, wink. Right? So those people who are in here in this lecture listening might understand. It's a negative punisher. It's a negative punisher. Okay? Now, in point of fact, I will tell you punishment is not great. It's not effective. And I'm not going to say this, Etta, because I'm not a tough guy I'm a soft psychologist. It's just I want my behavior to be as effective as possible. I don't want to have to waste time training my kids. And it turns out that reinforcement is a much better child rearing technique, much more effective than punishment. Kids can easily learn what to do, but it's hard for them to learn not what to do because a lot of times, somebody mentioned it earlier in class, they develop hostile feelings towards the punisher, and that's not a helpful situation. A lot of kids develop fear. And most of the time, they only avoid the behavior when the punisher is around. However, if you are going to punish your child, you must punish them quickly. You must punish them every time, and the punishment actually has to be kind of obnoxious, okay? If you're sending your kid up to their room as punishment and they have video games up there, you're wasting your time, dude. You're just totally wasting your time. If you're going to take the kid's cell phone away but let them have the tablet or the iPad, you're wasting your time, right? So either don't punish or punish all the time in a noxious way. Okay. You know, actually, I typically don't want to deal with things in the chat bar, but Jack, if you could, please, let's try to keep the focus on the class. Okay, could you? I'd appreciate that. Okay. Now, if you'll remember, I mentioned in class this idea that Skinner thought that learning and conditioning was everything, and there was no need to attribute anything to the mind. And his philosophical belief sort of became known as radical behaviorism, this idea that everything in the world was created by operant conditioning. In fact, if you think about it, genetics can even be explained, natural selection and evolution can even be explained in behavioristic terms, right? Some evolutionary changes are reinforced, and some evolutionary changes, some mutations are punished. And so you can really start to explain a lot of things using behavioral terms, and B.F. Skinner thought that we should actually do that. And so this sort of represents behaviorism becoming really arrogant and full of itself. And in fact, you'll see right beside me here is a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which is basically what he argued in this book is we need a technology of behavior. We need to get rid of the stupid idea of free will and understand that everything is conditioned and develop the perfect utopian environment by conditioning people to do the things we want and not doing the things we don't want, all right? So free will is an illusion. Thoughts and beliefs are really subject to environmental forces and their consequences rather than causes. And this extreme position was kind of hard to defend. This extreme position was hard to defend scientifically. And if you remember in webinar, I showed you how it's quite possible to demonstrate that people have a potent mind. Insight learning. If you'll remember, I showed you that. But there are lots of reasons why behaviorism fell in on its own weight, and I've got them presented here quickly. Number one, behaviorism just can't explain how language develops. Language milestones are the same all over the world. If it's all about environment, then language milestones ought to be different based upon what culture you learn languages in. And children all over the world make the same kind of language mistakes as they're developing language, which couldn't happen if it was all based on environment. Your book's going to show a picture of a raccoon in there, and it turns out that if you try to train an animal to do a behavior that is similar to an instinctual behavior that they do, they will revert to the instinctual behavior instead. So they tried to train these raccoons to take a coin and put it in a piggy bank for a food reward. And they found that the animal could do that with one coin, but as soon as you gave them 2 coins, they started rubbing the coins together and dipping them in water, which is what they instinctually did with their food, and that would override the operant conditioning that they were learning. So there are some instincts you can't train through. And we're not going to talk about it all because it's a 10 or 15 minute talk, but there are limits to some things which can and cannot be classically conditioned together. And if anybody's interested, please ask me and I can talk to you at length about the Garcia effect. But biology matters in an important way that really shapes what can and can't be conditioned. And also I showed you in webinar that the mind matters. Animals have insight. They figure things out. And if the mind can figure things out, this goes directly against any theory which says that the mind has no potency. All right, you'll see the picture right below me. This is what was demonstrated in Edward Tolman's cognitive map experiment. He put rats in a maze, and he gave some of them cheese at the end of the maze, and he didn't give the others cheese at the end of the maze. And he found after 10 days, the rats who were getting cheese at the end of the maze found their way to that spot on the maze much quicker than the rats who were not getting cheese. On the 11th day, he put cheese in the same place for the rats who were not getting reinforced. And instead of slowly figuring out where the cheese was, the rats went exactly straight to the cheese, demonstrating that even though they weren't getting reinforced, they were still building a map of that maze that they could use when the time became right. All right. Albert Bandura did his famous Bobo doll experiment where he showed that children will copy the violent behavior of an adult. If you've ever heard them talk about the impact that violent TV has on children's violent behavior, it all goes back to Albert Bandura in his Bobo doll experiment. And you know what? Somebody invented the computer, which is a stinking thinking brain. And since somebody invented a brain that could follow systematic processes and produce output, that was the final nail in the coffin of behaviorism, where people said, you know what? We need a new model for thinking about how human beings behave in the world. So, to wrap it up, behaviorism focuses on how the environment shapes human behavior. I told you that. They're very interested in how the environment shapes our behavior. Today we talked about operant conditioning, which is learning by consequence. And I told you that we have positive consequences and negative consequences, and these consequences may either cause us to engage in a behavior more often or to engage in a behavior less often. All right? And that these different patterns of consequences affect behavior differently. And then I do want you to understand the limitations of behaviorism. It does not fully explain the human experience. And this is why we don't have behavioral psychologists as a profession anymore. We have other professions who use behavioral terms and concepts in studying their more fully developed pictures of human functioning. Would you need to drink a sip with each second, each time you're scared? Messing around. Okay. All right. Well, look, I'm about at the end of the lecture. It looks like I may have some things to sort out offline, and I'll do that at a later time. Thanks to everybody for coming to lecture. Please don't forget to do the Neuromatrix, which is available tomorrow morning. Don't forget to do the discussion board to get your extra credit or your collaboration credit if you didn't come to the webinar. And remember, homework number 6 is due on Sunday. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. If you do have any questions, type them in the chat bar and I will handle them after the broadcast, okay? Take care and have a great day.